Hello, and welcome to the house. Today is the 19th of April, and we are into the third day of this year's Festival of Unleavened Bread, which lasts until the 20th. We have been commemorating this time together by sharing a 3-part Passover story mini-series, and this morning we'll be looking at the conclusion of those stories. Today is a day which some call Holy Saturday, or the day on which we remember after Jesus was crucified and died, he was laid in the tomb where he lay until Sunday morning. We hope that as we journey through our story, that this can impact our lives with a renewed force and in a fresh and perhaps unexpected way. We will share this time together through prayer, music, and of course, story. In case you're new here and don't know what's going on, my name's Natalie Kendel. I am pastor here at the house, and I will also be your host for today. You've joined us on the official YouTube channel of the house. The house is an online house church where we share Bible stories, prayer, music, social justice advocacy, and we also celebrate Shabbat together. To begin, let's sing together, "Help Me, O Lord," a musical prayer asking God to help us to do what is right, to move us from the things which harm and hurt us towards better things instead. Psalm 25, 4-5 says, "Show me the right path, O Lord. Point out the road for me to follow. Lead me by your truth and teach me, for you are the God who saves me. All day long I put my hope in you." The lyrics will be on the screen so you can sing along, and if you'd like to familiarize yourself with the songs which we often sing here at the house, you'll find a playlist on our channel called Congregational Songs. There you'll find just such a collection. into darkness. Grow in me, Lord, a hunger for truth, that I may love your justice. Help me, O Lord, to do what is right. Help me, my God, to follow. Help me, O Lord, to move towards the light, away from what's harmful, hollow. You know my sins, you see my faults, you know my greatest failings. Still you commit, time and again, to offer me new beginnings. Help me, O Lord, to do what is right. Help me, my God, to follow. Help me, O Lord, to move towards the light, away from what's harmful, hollow. I want to choose what is just, do what is kind and honest. Only by your Spirit and might can we live out compassion. Help us, O Lord, to do what is right. Help us, our God, to follow. Help us, O Lord, to move towards the light, away from what's harmful, hollow. Help us, O Lord, to do what is right. Help us, our God, to follow. Help us, O Lord, to move towards the light, away from what's harmful, hollow. Help me, my God, to follow. Sometimes here at the house we share examples of people who in everyday lives are being image bearers, carrying the image of God, the love of God into the world. And today's example comes from an anonymous confession shared on Fesshole. My neighbours are too low income to afford a Wi-Fi connection and too proud to use mine, so I renamed mine Free Council Wi-Fi and told them that I had read about it and what the password was. My neighbour is now halfway through an online college qualification, and I'm so proud of her. Let us be inspired by this loving example. Let's now pray together before we move on. Jesus, we'd like to ask that you will feed our hearts and minds today with something which meets us in our particular hungers. That may be a hunger for inspiration, for encouragement, for assurance, for safety, for being challenged, or for clarity. May anyone who consents to it be moved by your Spirit and be refreshed and walk away feeling different in the best possible way. Lighten loads today. There are many of us who have been carrying too much for too long and we're tired. For anyone who's hurting today, please bring relief. For anyone who's lonely, please bring them community. For those who are neglected, rush to their side and let them feel seen. For those who are on wrong or harmful paths, we ask that you will mercifully wake them up. For those who are disillusioned, meet them frankly and compassionately. And for those who are waiting, do not delay, Lord. As always, Jesus, we pray together as one for our people in Palestine, they who are being exterminated, persecuted, hunted by the Israeli colonial project. My God, please, it's been so long put an end to it. Liberate Palestine and break the occupation. May we stand loudly and firmly in solidarity and protest with them, and be strengthened by remembering that all empire falls in the end. You will make sure of it. And that also the people of Sudan, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, Yemen, all those who are bravely resisting but drowning under the oppression of Western greed, colonialism and imperialism, bring justice quickly. And may we each be a form and a force of justice in this world. May your justice burn like the sun, Jesus. As we go through our story today, we also ask that you will open our eyes to what each of us needs to see. Thank you, Jesus, for hearing our prayer. Amen. As we're going to dive into our story for this morning, let's sing together Teach Us, O Rabbi, which is a call and response song for those who seek to learn. As children sitting at your feet, teach us, O Rabbi. Expand our minds with what you reveal. Teach us, O Rabbi. Your words are like food and they nurture me. Teach us, O Rabbi. I need more than bread so my soul can breathe. Teach us, O Rabbi. O great teacher, none's like you. Scholars, scribes, or wise men. When you speak, you're speaking life, filled with so much healing. And though some may come to you in the dark, teach us, O Rabbi, that like Nicodemus will glimpse a spark. Teach us, O Rabbi. O great teacher, none's like you. Scholars, scribes, or wise men. When you speak, you're speaking life, filled with so much meaning. Help us to be good listeners. Teach us, O Rabbi. Humble and wise, do what we have learned. Teach us, O Rabbi. Teach us, O Rabbi. Our story today is found in Matthew chapter 26. We explore this story in parallel with this year's Passover festival and the events which took place one particular Passover during Jesus' 33rd year of living and walking among us as a human on earth. This is the third and final story in this year's three-part mini Passover series, in which we've been looking at some of the events leading up to the death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. Last time, we looked at the story called Better for One Man to Die, in which we were a fly on the wall at a pivotal meeting of the Sanhedrin, a meeting of the top Jewish religious leaders. They are discussing the problem that is Jesus, asking what should they do about this troublemaker, this threat to their power. And we saw how the chairman of that meeting, the high priest and the highest ranked religious leader in Judea, argues that there can only be one path to achieving a positive outcome. Jesus must die, arguing better for one man to die than a nation to perish. Well, today is the continuation of that storyline. What happened after everyone left that Sanhedrin council meeting? How did the emerging plot to kill Jesus play out? What happens is that a unique opportunity presents itself to the Sanhedrin in the form of a man named Judas. Judas was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, one of the 12 who lived each day learning with, eating with, traveling with Jesus. But Judas decides along the way that he is going to betray Jesus. We can read about this in Matthew chapter 26 from verse 14. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So if we remember from last week's story, the challenge the Sanhedrin were facing was how to capture Jesus. It was difficult, if not impossible, for them to do this in public, because many people in the land believed, in the least, that Jesus was a prophet of God. Crowds were constantly swarming around him and following Jesus wherever he went. So finding Jesus alone could be a challenge. And as we discovered, the Sanhedrin feared the people. They feared their reaction. They feared an angry mob forming in response to their trying to grab Jesus. And so, how were they to get their hands on him? Well, Judas is now their way in. He's become their inside man. With no prompting, he's come to them. He approaches some of the priests in the Jerusalem temple. Judas is offering to hand Jesus over to them on a silver-coined platter. The noose is tightening, the plot developing quickly, and less than a week after the Sanhedrin meet and conclude that Jesus must die, all the plotting and planning and scheming comes to a peak. It's Thursday night, the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. Jesus and his disciples have finished that evening's communion meal. They have gone into a local garden, an olive grove, called Gethsemane, to speak and pray. And John 18 says, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons." Judas has led Jesus' enemies right to him, and now they are confident enough to grab him in the dark, private, unseen place, away from the public, hidden beneath the olive trees. Unjust acts are often done in the dark. And verse 12 says, "Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. And Matthew 26 says, In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, that is, this crowd of temple guards and Jewish officials who have come to arrest him, "Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is all to take place, that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Now the captured and bound Jesus is about to be taken to several places, several stops in his trial process. The first place he's taken to we already read about in John 18 verse 13. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. So that evening, Jesus is brought before a man called Annas. He is brought to Annas' own house. Meanwhile, Peter and John are following at a distance. Verse 15, because this disciple, here referring to John, was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple who was known to the high priest came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. Jesus is taken to Annas' house for the sake of being questioned. And because of John's connections, both John and Peter are eventually permitted to come in as well, so that they are able to be present and see and hear what's happening inside. We say inside, but note here that Jesus doesn't seem to be brought into the actual house, only into the house's courtyard. And this is no accident. Enemies of Jesus would have viewed him as a sinner, a heretic, and therefore ceremonially unclean. And according to Jewish law, when an unclean person or object enter one's house, everyone in that house too becomes ceremonially unclean, and must therefore go through a cleansing process, a cleansing ritual, to once again be permitted to take part in religious ceremonies, enter synagogues and the temple. Now again, this is still Thursday night. It's the first evening of the festival of unleavened bread. Annas would have been inside, having the Passover meal with his family, just like Jesus had had with his disciples earlier that evening. And Annas has a whole festival ahead of him, including trips to the temple. So he doesn't want to, by contact with Jesus, become himself unclean. And so, Jesus is kept outside, in the courtyard, like some diseased creature. Not only that, but the text tells us that it's a cold night, and Jesus is still kept standing, bound outside. Verse 18, it was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. It's so cold that the servants are huddling around a fire in the courtyard. Now, as Peter and John listen and watch, this is what happens in the courtyard of Annas. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. Jesus' response here is very similar to what he said to the temple guards back in the olive grove. He says, I've openly conducted myself. I've worked in public for all to see, for all to witness what I'm about. This is not merely a defense of himself, but it's also a criticism of what's happening here. Jesus says, I've done nothing in secret, and without having to say much more, everyone listening knows that this contrasts with how Jesus has now been arrested and brought here by the priests. Jesus hasn't hidden his motives or actions. Jesus hasn't worked in shameful, unwitnessed corners. But unjust acts are often done in the dark. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Jesus' criticism of the unjust way in which the religious leaders are conducting themselves seems to strike a nerve in a big way, and he is physically hit by one of the officials. "How dare you? How dare you speak to the high priest in this way?" Jesus' defense leans on truth. The religious leader's attack leans on pride, worship of title, and a sense of entitlement. Now, before we proceed and see what happens next when Jesus is taken from the house of Annas to Caiaphas, let's pause to clarify a few things, because you may have noticed something in the text that's a bit confusing. Namely, there are two men being called high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. Annas is called the high priest. The official who struck Jesus says, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" But Caiaphas is also called high priest. And you may have gone, "Hold on a minute. Isn't there only supposed to be one high priest of the people at a time? So which is it? Who is the high priest in Judea?" To understand what's happening here, we must first understand the origin and the role of the high priest. The role of the nation's high priest originated in the Sinai desert in the days of Moses. The people of Israel had just been freed from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them out of there, across the Red Sea, and now they find themselves in the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, meeting this foreign God who is unknown to them. During this time in the desert, God spends time introducing himself to a people. Just like in any relationship, he is showing them who he is, declaring what his intentions with them are, what his values are, what his boundaries are. And in this introduction process, God is trying to build a bridge between himself and these human beings, to again show them who he is and what his intentions are. One way which God does this is by setting up a symbolic system which will allow mortal human beings to engage with, to approach an all-powerful God. And this system is called the tabernacle system, or the tabernacle service. The tabernacle refers to the tent in which God comes to live in, his tent among the people's tents, his dwelling among the people's dwelling. He comes down from heaven, down from the mountain where he's met with Moses, and finally down to the level plain beneath the mountain to pitch his tent among theirs. The tabernacle system which God sets up through his specific instructions is, as we said, riddled with symbolism. The structure of the tent, what the tent contains, the worship system set up around the tabernacle is all meant to communicate. It's all trying to speak to the people. Each part saying something about God himself and how they might be in a relationship with him. Now, to be in charge of the maintenance, the service in the temple, God designates a priestly system. People plucked from among the Israelites are to serve in the tabernacle. And the person in charge, the highest ranked among these priests, will be the high priest. The very first high priest who serves is chosen by God. It is Aaron, the brother of Moses. God indicates that Aaron is the chosen high priest by making Aaron's walking staff miraculously sprout, bud, blossom, and even produce almonds overnight. This was the sign from God to the people that he had chosen Aaron, and it would be others from the family of Aaron and from his tribe, the tribe of Levi, who would serve as tabernacle priests from here on out. Aaron and his sons, and those who in later years followed as high priests, were in charge of representing Israel before God. It was their job to bring the people's prayers to God and to make offerings for the people's sins. The reason people couldn't just come straight to God directly and do that themselves is because the Israelites refused this. They were afraid of God, afraid of him speaking directly to them. And so they demanded that someone be their intercessor, their go-between, between themselves and God. With such a huge responsibility, the responsibility of being a mediator between God and people, the high priestly role came with many very strict and very specific laws given by God. He gave them to try to protect the people from priests who would be corrupt, priests who would abuse their power, who could poison this precious symbolism, the precious message of the tabernacle and what it said to the people about who God is. Because if the priest is corrupt, then the message becomes corrupted. Then the people's view of God becomes corrupted. One high priest could stain a whole nation's relationship to God, a whole people's beliefs about who God is. Sadly, despite all God's efforts, those protection measures failed. There's a long story, which we won't go into now, but the people of Israel and Judah experienced much suffering and trouble because of corrupt priests and high priests. Now, later down the road, the tent God lived in among his people, the tabernacle, was replaced by the temple in Jerusalem. So God moved from the tent and into the temple built by Solomon, the son of King David. And with this move, all that symbolism, all the objects inside, the priestly service, were all transferred to the temple. And now the priests work in the Jerusalem temple instead. We mentioned that God had very specific rules concerning the priests, concerning the high priest, to protect the people from corruption. And one of these rules was that it is God who appoints the high priest. It is not a democratically elected position. It is not a popularity contest. And though the high priest was meant to come from Aaron's line or from the tribe of Levi, the individual was still meant to be selected by God, appointed and ordained by God. But something had changed in Judea. In the days of Jesus, God was no longer appointing high priests in the temple. The high priestly position had now become a political appointment. But it was far worse than that. Firstly, there was Annas, son of Seth. Annas served as high priest from 6 AD to 15 AD. He was not chosen by God. He was appointed to the position by Quirinius, Roman governor of Syria. In 15 AD, Annas' position was taken from him. He was deposed by another ruler, Valerius Gratus, the Roman procurator of Judea. A procurator was an agent representing others in a court of law in places which had Roman civil law. It could also be a treasury officer in a province of the Roman Empire. So Valerius steps in, he removes Annas from his position as high priest, but though officially removed, Annas remained extremely influential in Judea, and we'll expand on that in a moment. Now, in the place of Annas, Valerius appointed Ishmael ben Phabus in 15 AD. But Ishmael's reign was a short one, for in 16 AD, Eleazar ben Annas, Eleazar, son of none other than Annas himself, became high priest. If Annas couldn't be high priest, he would make sure to maneuver his son into that position. Again, there was an attempt to appoint a high priest outside the family of Annas. Valerius again steps in and appoints Simon ben Camathus instead. But Simon didn't last long. For in 18 AD, Joseph ben Caiaphas, also known to us as Caiaphas, was made high priest by Valerius Gratus. Caiaphas, as we know, was none other than the son-in-law of Annas. Annas may have been a deposed man, but over the coming years, he had 5 of his sons become high priest, as well as his son-in-law Caiaphas. What we're seeing here is a family dynasty. The appointment of Caiaphas initiates a dynastic control of the temple service and the high priestly role, reinforced by Roman political and military authority. This means that the Romans, who were occupying Judea at the time of Jesus, were now appointing and deposing the high priests in the Jerusalem temple. We might ask, why on earth Rome allowed any Jews to serve in such influential positions to begin with? The answer is, it's good imperial tactics. If you pick the right person, someone who loves power and who knows how to keep in line, then this is a good way to keep the nation in check, while also maintaining imperial control behind the scenes. The Roman rulers would frequently change high priests in order to avoid anyone gaining too much influence, avoid them potentially leading an uprising. This is likely why Annas was deposed when he was, because Rome viewed him as the most powerful of them. But then we come to Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas in particular was in office for an unusually long time for a priest under Roman rule. He held his position for about 18 years. How could he do that? Well, because he kept peace with Rome. Caiaphas wasn't seen as a threat. He was seen as an extension of Roman power and rule. He was an asset to them. And this was the man who was representing the people to God. This was the man who is meant to be the go-between between the people and God. And now we come to the question, why are both Annas and Caiaphas being referred to as high priests? Well, Luke does a fantastic job at subtly but powerfully making a point. In Luke 3:2, when Luke is setting the stage before the birth of Jesus, he writes, "During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness." Now, why is Luke 3:2 so significant? Because in Jewish law, there could only be one high priest at a time, as stated, for example, in Numbers 35:25 and Leviticus 21:10. Luke is not making a mistake. He is laying a path of breadcrumbs for people to lead them to a conclusion, namely, that Annas still holds enormous influence. He is the patriarch of a powerful, corrupt, priestly family. Luke is saying Caiaphas holds the title, but Annas still wields power like a king behind the curtain. And how is that possible? Through Roman political manipulation. And why is Annas allowed to wield power like he's a king? Because of the lingering Jewish loyalty to Annas as a legitimate priest. The point Luke is driving home is that there is religious corruption in Judea with Roman influence. The fact that both Annas and Caiaphas are mentioned shows that the office was no longer based on divine calling, but on politics and nepotism. The role itself has been hollowed out and filled with corruption. It is political theater of the priesthood. And because we now know the history of the original high priest and what the role was meant to be, now Annas and Caiaphas stand in complete contrast with God's way of appointing priests. And again, what Luke does so brilliantly in a single sentence is this. He states that Annas and Caiaphas and the Jerusalem high priestly position is completely corrupted, but God is finding other people to work with. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Here there are two high priests in Jerusalem. But God doesn't speak to either of them. He speaks to John. The contrast is stark. God bypasses the temple, bypasses the high priestly office and its corrupt leadership, to instead speak to a man in the desert, to a man in camel's hair by the Jordan River. This is indeed setting the stage before the birth of the Messiah, because it introduces a theme of inversion. Those in power are spiritually deaf, while the wilderness man hears from God. Already before Jesus' birth, something is being foreshadowed, that God is moving, but he's not moving through the correct channels. So this is why Luke refers to Annas as a high priest, why the people during Jesus' trial continue to call Annas the high priest, why the official strikes Jesus for seemingly disrespecting Annas as high priest. And note why Jesus is brought first to Annas, not to Caiaphas. The people clearly view Annas as the man in charge. They go first to him. And so now we understand what's happening here. A political pawn, authority derived from Rome, not God's sovereignty. Annas' high priestly family dynasty contrasting with Aaron, divinely appointed and reliant on God's call. Now, with that history and understanding in mind, let's continue to the second place Jesus is brought to on the night of his trial, because Annas sends Jesus to his son-in-law's house. Matthew 26, verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. The first thing to note here is that the Sanhedrin, the council of the highest Jewish religious leaders, has already assembled. So they're ready. They had planned for this to happen. The second thing to note here lies in the original language. In many English translations, we read that Jesus was taken to Caiaphas, or there is in other texts mention of Caiaphas's house. Luke 22:54 states this the clearest. Then, seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Earlier on, when the Sanhedrin had first assembled to plot the murder of Jesus, Matthew 26:3 tells us, "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the house of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him." Both the meeting where the plot against Jesus was made, as well as the trial of Jesus now on this evening, are being held in the house of Caiaphas. Except, it doesn't say house in the original Greek text. It says palace. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. Jesus is being brought to the palace of Caiaphas, in the Greek aule, and this word speaks volumes. In Roman-occupied Judea, aule referred to elite residences, halls, and sometimes official residence of ruling authorities, so palace is an appropriate translation here. But why is the Judean high priest living in a palace? According to Jewish law, the high priest was meant to live among the people, serving with humility and leading them in repentance. Yet here we find that Caiaphas is in fact living in a luxurious compound, referred to in the Gospels as a palace, an architectural mark of status and power, and indicated by the word chosen here. It was likely a palace built or first belonging to the Romans, which means Caiaphas was given this palace to live in by the Romans. If there was any doubt in our minds that Caiaphas is on the payroll of Rome and is an extension of their arm, then this ought to put it to rest. Mention of Caiaphas living in a palace is ironic and damning, because he ought to be a servant leader. That was the role of the high priest. That was his job. But instead he's a political aristocrat living in a mansion in league with Rome. According to Josephus in his works Antiquities 18.2.2, the high priests of the time when Jesus lived were incredibly wealthy, running lucrative temple operations, money changing, the business of sacrificial animals, things we've looked at before here at the house in other stories. And here we have Caiaphas's palace, which was likely in the upper city of Jerusalem, which was a wealthy priestly neighborhood. In Al-Quds, in occupied Palestine today, there is a site called St. Peter in Gallicantu, traditionally believed to be built over Caiaphas's palace. And sure enough, excavations beneath had revealed first-century priestly homes, stone courtyards, holding cells, and a dungeon. The dungeon had iron rings in the walls, consistent with Roman-style detention chambers. Again, we must ask ourselves, why does the high priest of Judea have prisons and a dungeon for prisoners beneath his home? And these dungeons were perhaps the place where Jesus was kept overnight before being taken to Pilate later on. Well, the Jewish religious leaders' fever dream, that is the capture and trial of Jesus, is finally happening. Jesus is taken inside Caiaphas's palace. He is still bound as though a violent criminal, and the Sanhedrin are now going to have an official trial, a court case against Jesus to decide his fate. Matthew 26 from verse 59. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, although many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" So, a lot is happening here. Let's break it down. Firstly, we are reminded that this trial is taking place at night. But Jewish law forbade death penalty trials at night or during festivals. We read in Mishnah Sanhedrin 4:1, "In capital cases, they hold the trial during the daytime and suspend the verdict until the following day." Simply by holding this trial at night, Caiaphas and the rest of them are breaking Jewish law. This went against the Mishnah and Talmud rules about trials. Secondly, by holding the trial at night during such an important festival, Caiaphas likely ensured that there were less than usual council members present. Because there were, in fact, some Pharisees of the Sanhedrin who were sympathetic towards Jesus, such as Nicodemus. Earlier in John we read, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who were one of their own number, asked, "Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he has been doing?" They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee." Another sympathetic member was a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision and action. And elsewhere in John it states, "Yet at the same time many even among the leaders believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue." The point here is that there would have been members among them who would support or even attempt at least some semblance of impartiality during a trial of Jesus. But Caiaphas has arranged this meeting at night, when many members would be at home having the Passover meal with their families, and this meant that it was possible for him to carry out what was in essence jury tampering. He could more easily stack the votes against Jesus, perhaps excluding Pharisees who were sympathetic towards Jesus' case. And the rush of it all, not waiting till the next day, strongly suggests that there was a rigged Sanhedrin that night, that not all 70 members of the council were present, and that there was even a possible lack of quorum. Thirdly, the fact that Jesus was taken first to Annas, who had no right to serve as judge or prosecutor, also counts as an unofficial hearing of Jesus, a thing which was forbidden by Jewish law and due process. Fourthly, verse 59 opens with, "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any, although many false witnesses came forward." The Sanhedrin, which was the high court in Judea, the highest Jewish legal and judicial body, is holding a trial. And what would we expect from such a judging body? For them to go in as impartial as possible. They are judges in a court case. And yet we're told that they are looking for false evidence to put Jesus to death. First of all, actively looking for evidence, meaning they've already made up their minds about what the outcome is going to be here, and are functioning as prosecutors instead of judges. And secondly, they are looking for false evidence, meaning they know that anything they present against Jesus will and must be fabricated. These men are entering the court proceedings already lying, already with an agenda, already corrupted. They've already made up their minds. We know that because we read about that secret meeting they had to plot against Jesus. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." So when witnesses finally come forward, their testimony is incorrect. They in fact misquote Jesus. In John 2, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." There were not 1 or 2 or even 3 court violations that night of Jesus' trial. In fact, there were at least 12. Here is the full list. We've already covered 1, 2, and 3, and now we arrive at the 4th. Verse 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. So an accusation has been made against Jesus. But Jesus, as the accused, hasn't been given any defense. There is no lawyer, no advocate present who is representing Jesus. Jewish law required that the accused be given the opportunity to defend himself. But Jesus remains silent after no advocate is offered. And despite this, Caiaphas continues, and by doing so is ignoring the Torah's legal safeguards. Next, we've been told that the Sanhedrin struggled to even find witnesses for the prosecution, but Mark adds more detail to this. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. According to the law, as stated in Deuteronomy 17:6, at least 2 agreeing witnesses were required for a case to be upheld. Even these false witnesses couldn't agree on their story. We've already established that the court is biased. This body, meant to be impartial and neutral, are not so at all. Note how the high priest speaks to Jesus. It is highly hostile. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. Notice the contrast between how everyone in that room is acting versus how Jesus is acting. Jesus is the calm center in the storm of voices, agendas, and hostility. His answers are measured, reasonable, clear. "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus replied, "You have said so." Now, the accused is bearing witness against the judge. Jesus continues, "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" The next procedural breach happens after Jesus replies. Caiaphas tears his clothes, a general cultural act at the time which expressed great grief or anguish or dishonor. Only it was against the law for a high priest to tear his clothes. According to Leviticus 21:10, the high priest was forbidden from tearing his clothing. Even if his own child died, he must not tear his clothing. Now Caiaphas already knows what the outcome of this trial is going to be. Why is he acting in this dramatic way? It is, at its core, performative. Just like this trial, it is theater, and he was willing to act like the scorned, horrified judge, even if it means having to break the law to do it. After he tears his clothes, Caiaphas turned to the Sanhedrin council and asks, "What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Note here, they all reply this. There is not a single voice recorded which disagrees. In the span of 5 seconds, everyone in the room has made a unanimous call. In July of 2004, a court case was held in New Zealand to determine whether or not the accused had been cultivating cannabis plants. The jury left to deliberate at 3:28 p.m. and returned with the verdict at 3:29 p.m. It took them 1 whole minute to acquit the accused, making this the shortest jury deliberation on record. Except, I think that the trial of Jesus might just have beaten it there. "He is worthy of death," they answered. They all answered. A unanimous verdict. And here's where we come to the next procedural violation. According to the Mishnah Sanhedrin 17a, an entirely unanimous guilty verdict in capital cases was considered grounds for acquittal, as it was seen as evidence of conspiracy or lack of mercy. If the Sanhedrin were following the law, they should have called this a mistrial and acquitted Jesus there and then. And finally, when the judgment is decided, we arrive at the final procedural violation that night. Jesus was abused during his trial. In fact, he was abused before his official trial even began. He's already been struck in the face back in Anna's courtyard. And now we read, "Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?'" Mark 14 adds a detail to this scene by describing Jesus as being blindfolded during this abuse. The utter corruption and bloodthirst of this group of religious leaders, this judicial body, has finally descended into outright violence. They taunt, they humiliate, and they bring down physical suffering on Jesus. The physical mistreatment of a prisoner was illegal, breaking every relevant Jewish law. The characters of Caiaphas and Jesus are held up throughout all 4 Gospels in a sort of mirroring, a juxtaposition. Caiaphas coming to his position when Jesus was 18, residing as high priest during the entire timeline of Jesus' public ministry. They are, in essence, living in the same world, moving in parallel circles, both claiming to serve the people. But what we see, what the writers of the Gospels are communicating loud and clear to us, is that Caiaphas and Jesus are opposites to each other. Again and again, at every step of the way in this narrative, this pattern emerges. Jesus and Caiaphas are antitheses to each other. Not only that, But Caiaphas is an anti-high priest. His actions, his character, his values, his choices, his priorities are all in opposition to what the high priests ought to be. Meanwhile, Jesus is this perfect picture of what a high priest was meant to be. And this contrasting of them, the contrasting between this anti-high priest and this perfect high priest, runs throughout the story. We can see here an overview of that comparison. What is the origin of their authority? The origin of Caiaphas' authority is political and Rome-appointed. Jesus' authority is divine and he is God-sent. How do they act in matters of justice? Well, we've seen in great detail how Caiaphas holds an illegitimate trial and condemnation, while Jesus faces lies with silence and then reveals the truth. Remember how Caiaphas is meant to be representing the people before God, as a sort of advocate, a lawyer, a go-between man? Well, one of those people included Jesus. How is Caiaphas, as high priest, representing Jesus, a member of the people? Caiaphas' intercession posture is as an accuser. He demands, he mocks, he tears his robe, he enacts a self-serving theatrical show, and in the process violates his position. Meanwhile, Jesus declares himself the Messiah, the chosen King of God, the Son of Man, and even under great pressure and accusation, he remains faithful to his mission. He sticks to what he's here to do, which is to represent the people and be their defender and their advocate. Caiaphas, when he said that it is better for one man to die than for a nation to perish, is speaking an unbelievable irony, because the high priest was the one who carried out and brought the animal sacrifice in the temple, which would cover the people's sins. His whole role is centered around a sacrificial act. Only he is willing to sacrifice everyone else. He is willing to sacrifice Jesus to maintain power, to maintain peace with Rome, their oppressors, and he is even willing to use people's blood to preserve his personal power. This is a twisted version of a high priest. Caiaphas will sacrifice anyone to preserve his power and privilege. Meanwhile, Jesus is willing to sacrifice himself. Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice. Notice the contrast. Caiaphas offers Jesus as a sacrifice, but Jesus volunteers and offers himself. He is willing to act powerless if it means saving the people. This act is described in Philippians chapter 2, speaking of Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the position of a servant, and was born as a human being. He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, except in the original Greek, the word is harpagmos, from the root word harpazo, meaning plunder, as in robbery. To seize by force, illegally, like a thief. Jesus refused to take power like that, unlike Caiaphas, who is nothing but a thief and a plunderer of power. And finally, without Caiaphas intending to, his plot against Jesus is actually prophetic, saying that one man will die for a people, and God uses the evil intentions of his enemies against them. He reverses it and turns it into his good plans, because he is willing to die for humans. not as a victim of random circumstances, but as part of a long-laid plan to reveal God's love and how far he's willing to go to once again pitch his tent among the people's tents and be close to human beings. Caiaphas and Jesus are each other's opposites. Caiaphas lives in a palace, a reward for his partnership with evil empire. Jesus had no place to lay his head, hunted and homeless. Caiaphas dined in honor and splendor. Jesus ate Passover in a borrowed upper room in the city. Caiaphas wields power in the shadows. Jesus was arrested in a garden and condemned in a palace. Caiaphas betrayed the very heart of his role as priest. Jesus left the heavenly temple to be taken into a corrupt earthly one and interceding with his own blood. Hebrews chapter 7 to 9 go into great detail about Jesus as this ultimate, this final high priest, and you can go and read about that if you want the full picture. But those chapters in Hebrews state that no other high priest is needed ever again. No other go-between between God and human beings. Jesus is the supreme high priest, who in an absurd and magnificent turn not only served as priest, but as the sacrifice itself. He is the priest who brings himself as the slaughtered lamb to make atonement for people on that Passover. After this long line of corrupt high priests abusing their power, their position, their title, Jesus comes along and shows them what a high priest was supposed to be. This is the stark and deep-hitting contrast between Jesus and Caiaphas, the corrupt anti-high priest who works in the shadows, who betrays his people, who loves power, and the true high priest, who works in the open for all to see, who loves his people and gives up power, even unto his own death, to save them, to make sure that they were never cut off from God, to make sure that they were always represented, their prayers always reach him, the sins of anyone repenting are always forgiven. Finally, in conclusion, we're going to zoom in on something Jesus said during his trial. There's this key moment during Jesus' trial in the palace of Caiaphas, verse 64. Caiaphas has questioned Jesus, and Jesus replies, addressing every person sitting in that council, "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now this statement in itself was a bomb to drop, because Jesus was outright stating that he is the Messiah, the chosen King of God. He says that they will, from now on, see Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, of God himself. To sit at the right hand of a ruler was to be the highest honored. It was to be as equal to him. Jesus here is claiming equality with God. But there's an even deeper layer to this statement. And to understand this layer, we must remember that Caiaphas was not a Pharisee. He was a Sadducee. The Pharisees were one sect of the Judaic faith, while the Sadducees were another religious sect. And though they presided over the same nation and sat on the same council, these two groups diverged on some theological doctrine. And one of those differences concerned the doctrine of resurrection. The Pharisees believed in a future judgment day, that God would judge the world, the living and the dead, and that the dead would be resurrected either to eternal life or to eternal death. But the Sadducees didn't believe that. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, in the afterlife, in angels. But what is Jesus talking about here? He's talking about the judgment day, about a future court case. Here, Jesus is standing, bound, at his own trial, but he's talking about another trial, a future trial that is coming when the tables will be turned. A day on which Jesus will not be the one on trial, but everyone in that room will be. Jesus will be resurrected. He will sit on the throne next to God. And coming with the clouds, he will return to earth to serve as judge on that future judgment day. Jesus strikes a damning blow at Caiaphas's Sadducean denial of resurrection. He is directly, in court, confronting Caiaphas's worldview. Even as he is about to go to his death, Jesus courageously speaks the truth. And in that room, acts more like a king, more like a ruler, more like a just judge, more like a mediator than anyone sitting there. And most starkly, than the meeting's chair who has betrayed his role at every turn. Not only that, but Jesus sitting at God's right hand meant he would share power with the all-powerful, mighty God. Jesus would have the one thing which Caiaphas loves the most, power. But Jesus wouldn't grab it. He would kneel and serve as a servant instead. Well, the jury has deliberated and the verdict is in. Jesus is condemned to death. Following the abuse these lofty, respected religious leaders rained down on him, Jesus is taken away to stand trial before Herod and finally before the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. He will be sentenced at the request of his own people, at the demand of his own people, to be executed through crucifixion. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and religious leaders will follow Jesus through every step of his trial, sentencing, and execution. They will push and insist on the Romans killing him. They will whip up the Jewish crowd to vote for Jesus' death. And they will stand beneath his cross, hurling insults and mocking him as he dies. Another key characteristic of the religious leaders was that they hated the Roman powers. Despite Caiaphas' allegiance to Rome, as a group, the Sanhedrin hated Rome interfering in any Judean or religious matters. They wanted independence, but they hated Jesus more. They hated Jesus so much that they were willing to ally themselves with Rome to make sure he is killed. And there is this chilling moment when Pilate, a Roman, an enemy of Judea, is actually trying to look for loopholes, looking for a way to spare Jesus' life. And he says to the Jewish religious leaders in John 19:15, "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. "We have no king but Caesar?" Those are Jewish religious leaders saying that their king is the Roman emperor, not God, not the Messiah, the emperor. Their allegiance to earthly empire is declared as absolute by their own mouths. Well, Jesus dies, offers himself up as a Passover sacrificial lamb that Friday. When he dies, the curtain in the temple, which separated the people from the section where God used to live, used to sit, is torn from top to bottom, communicating to every priest, every person, to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, that some separation has been torn apart, because a truer, greater high priest has become the bridge, has become the go-between between God and his people. God himself is the bridge. And on the third day, on Sunday, Jesus rises from the dead, just as he said he would. News of Jesus' resurrection reaches Caiaphas, and he is terrified. But does this stop him in his tracks, or cause him to rethink his path? No. His corruption continues as he bribes the Roman guards to tell no one that they have witnessed Jesus' resurrection. He is still suppressing the truth through bribery, corruption, and further partnership with Rome. Caiaphas will, in the coming years, go on to imprison, threaten, have flogged any followers of Jesus. He will seek to kill Jesus' disciples, persecute Christians, bring charges against Peter and John for healing a lame man, and later a man called Saul, who will become known as Paul, likely sought and received official written permission from Caiaphas, authorizing him to go and arrest Christians in Damascus and drag them off to dungeons and their following executions. Caiaphas sat in his palace while the Lamb of God was being betrayed. The high priest surrounded by walls of stone that couldn't protect him from the truth. In that palace, power conspired to kill the truth himself. But what they did not know was that the real high priest had already entered the Holy of Holies, not with a lamb's blood, but with his own. And things would never be the same again. Caiaphas, the anti-high priest, the false high priest, represents not merely one person in a long-ago story, but represents the pattern of all corrupt religion, which favors power over truth and justice, corrupt ritual without faith. He represents the harmful religious leaders and authorities which again and again in every age conspire with empire and thus betray their responsibility. We must let the depth of this sink in for us. Jesus, God himself, was rejected and betrayed by the official priestly system. Even the official religious systems around us can be not merely deeply flawed and human, but in direct opposition of God's will, God's law, and God's heart. We must follow the Spirit and the way of Jesus, not the official religious voices around us. And as we walk away from this story, let us ask ourselves some very important questions. Which Christian leadership and influences are conspiring with empire today? Who are betraying the weakest, most vulnerable, marginalized among us? Who are choosing comfort, power, control, and the status quo which so benefits them, while betraying the very people they are meant to serve and protect? Have we accepted that this is who they are? And are we willing to walk away from their spaces and away from their leadership? To anyone who does seek a better way, there is such good news, because there is a true high priest who would rather give up power, suffer, and die than betray you. A high priest who is soon coming as judge, who will stand next to every person who was exploited, denied justice, ignored, and abused in this age, and he will bring justice. There is a true high priest who mediates for you, a priest who makes perfect intercession and will uphold your case until all is made right. And finally, remember, the word of God didn't come to Annas or Caiaphas. It came to a prophet in the wilderness. The Spirit of God didn't work through the proper channels, but through the denied, the underestimated, and untitled. The presence of God didn't live in the temple in Jerusalem. He had left long ago. But it lived among the poor, in the slums, among the foreigners, in the ghettos of Nazareth and Galilee. And the will of God was not carried out by the high priests, for they had despised justice. But thankfully, the true high priest was on his way.